it's always great to see so many people join, especially on a Monday morning and I know that everyone's busy and could be doing many other things. So I appreciate the time that you're taking to be with us today. As you know, on July 17th, just last Monday, we adopted amendments to our stormwater management rules and flood hazard rules to address what we're calling inland flooding. It's precipitation-driven flooding. And I say it that way because to draw a distinction between flooding that is precipitation-driven as opposed to sea level rise driven. And I'm going to hand it over to Assistant Commissioner Katie Angerone for a few opening remarks, and then I'll come into what we're doing.
All right, and then we'll go back to your regularly scheduled show. I'm Katie Angerone. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Watershed and Land Management. I am delighted to see so many folks here. You know, planning ahead is not the easy choice, but it is certainly the right one. And it's one that you don't regret. And that's exactly what the Inland Flood Protection Rule is about. It's New Jersey once again deciding to prepare. And preparing is an investment, one that will pay for itself in ways that are really not so easy to quantify, but we know. And we know this because New Jersey has had a strong history of floodplain regulations for decades. And as we watch other jurisdictions try and catch up, we can see how much harder it is to begin to invest when good planning has been deferred. And that's not the situation we are in New Jersey. And I'm thankful for it. And we also know this because occasionally the homeowner who elevated 2 or 3 years ago and whose home was spared from the next flood does in fact come back and thank Vince and our staff. So, you know, we know that we're also already seeing the impacts to our quality of life and our economy from flooding. New Jersey has a strong history of planning ahead, whether it's for water supply, floodplain management, or coastal resources. So I do want to take this minute to just thank Governor Murphy and Commissioner LaTourette for continuing that tradition. The best climate science tells us that we are, for the next few decades, the impacts that are headed our way can't be undone. They're related to emissions that were released in the past. So while other programs at DEP necessarily focus on reducing future impacts for our kids and our grandkids, these rules are aimed at adapting to help our communities weather what we know is coming and what we're already seeing. Because we're implementing new rules, and because that necessarily comes with questions, as I said from the outset, we are committed to hosting several sessions, ensuring that our staff is trained up, and generally being ready and available to respond to your inquiries. So as Vince said, today's just the first step. So without further ado, let me introduce our State Floodplain Administrator, Vince Mazzei, who will guide us through the new regulations. And we'll also hear from our stormwater expert, Gabriel Mann, who will help answer questions that you have today. And thanks for taking this journey with us.
Thanks, Katie. Well said. All right, well, let's get into it. Everybody can see my screen, I hope, the PowerPoint.
Yes.
Good, thank you. All right, so my plan today is, like I said, spend about 45 minutes walking through the kind of the basis and background for what we did, how we got here, and what the contents of the rule are. And I go into some detail, and it might be more detail than you might want to hear on a Monday morning, but I figured it's good. It's a good resource for everyone to have. I can put this PowerPoint as an attachment in this meeting, so that way you can use it, you can review it, you can go back to it. If you're like me, you know, 2-3 hours after the presentation or the next day, you're going to have a question. So as Katie said, this is just the beginning. You can review it again. You can email us. You can ask for another one of these webinars if we need it. So we're here for you. All right. So a little background, and you know, some of the stuff I've covered in previous webinars, but I think it's always good to kind of set the stage as to like where we are. So New Jersey is blessed with plenty of water, surface waters, and that's wonderful. And as a result, though, our sediments from European colonial days are on waterways, because waterways were the navigation paths for people. They were the roadways, and they operated mills and whatnot. So water brings life to communities. However, that means that all of our communities, our older communities, have a stream or river going right through the middle of it, which means that not an insignificant portion of these communities are in flood zones. And development that happened in the past, and even up to up to the present weren't always designed with flood risk in mind. And it's all about that assessment of that flood risk, right? If you were buying a piece of property, if you were looking for a place to live, or you're buying, thinking of renting a building for a business, you might pick up a FEMA flood map and assume that that is a good approximation or indicator of your flood risk on the site. And the problem, though, is that the flood risk that's shown on those maps is measured by what's happened in the past, right? It's a projection in the future from what's happened in the past. And if there's one thing that we know about climate change is that that progression of these things is no longer linear, right? Stationarity is dead. So we can't use flood maps that were based on data that was collected 50 years ago or more, shown on FEMA flood insurance rate maps, which were produced by FEMA to let insurers know and themselves know how much insurance to charge someone. So it basically is a flood insurance tool. And we realize that not only does it not accurately show what your flood risk is today, but it's definitely not a predictor of tomorrow's flood risk, because it doesn't include any climate change data in it. And so here we are, we're faced with these flood maps that we use, and they're useful, but how do we adapt them to a changing climate? And the basis of this, of course, is that people need to be aware of the flood risks when they're buying, when they're renting, when they're developing property. And although mapping is a good place to start, we've seen over and over again that flooding goes past that line on the map, because the flood doesn't know it's supposed to stop at that line on the map. And I'm going to show you some aerials. I'm going to show you some examples where just recently the flooding has gone significantly past the line on the map, and the people outside that line are not often protected. They don't know that they should get flood insurance. They don't know that they're at a flood risk. So here's a snapshot of New Jersey, kind of just to set the table. 9.2 million people, most densely populated state in the nation. About 16% of the state lies within a flood hazard area. Good, somebody muted me too. All right, thank you. Yeah, just a reminder as you're joining in to keep yourself muted so that there's no feedback. We estimate about 16% of the state lies within a flood hazard area. And we have a pretty serious problem in New Jersey. Just according to the 2019 State Hazard Mitigation Plan, we've got $241 billion of buildings exposed to the 1% chance flood, which is the 100-year flood. We've got 3 million properties not covered by National Flood Insurance Program flood insurance policies. We've got tens of thousands of repetitive loss properties, most of which are single-family homes, severe repetitive loss properties. Critical infrastructure in the flood hazard area is numerous. So we have significant problems, and I don't have to remind people that every time there's a flood, there's damage to people's homes, there's damage to infrastructure, and there's a cost that's associated with that. We've got $15.3 billion in obligations under post-disaster grants just in a 30-year period. And interestingly enough, and this plays into it, we actually have the highest foreclosure rate in the nation. So what that means is that when you put all those things together, it's not surprising that FEMA said as far back as 2004 that flooding is New Jersey's #1 natural hazard. Now, we've known that flooding has been a problem in the state for decades, and we've taken steps over the years to address it. We have a program that deals with flooding and floodplain management that goes back to 1929. We have a floodplain that's bigger than FEMA's floodplain, right? We regulate a flood that's 25% bigger in the past than FEMA's 1% flood, because we recognized that flooding was getting larger for a variety of reasons, development being probably the main driver of the first intention of adding 25%. And then we have 1 foot of freeboard on the flood hazard design flood. So when you take this bigger flood, you add a foot to it, and that's your floor elevation for buildings or the surface of your roadway. We have 0% net fill across the whole state. I was at a conference recently in Raleigh, it was the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and we gave a presentation to the group about what New Jersey was doing, and no other state is doing anything like this. No, when I was explaining the concept of flood storage displacement, that when you put some building or fill in a floodplain, that the water that would be going there has to go someplace else, and so we have to balance that. Folks in other states were astonished that we've done that. We've done that for years. We have to have dry access for critical buildings and multi-residence buildings. So if you're putting in a new hospital or an apartment building, you have to have roads that can get to and from the building so that emergency vehicles can get there, that people can evacuate. We've got progressive statewide stormwater management policies on the forefront of the state. We've got stream corridor protection standards through our riparian zones. But despite everything that we've done so far, flood damage continues to increase every year. And so we felt that it was incumbent on us to take action. So if you put it all together, you've got the most densely populated state. You've got chronic flooding issues going back hundreds of years. About 16% of the state lies in a flood hazard area, and more than 16% of the population is in that flood hazard area. We have enormous development pressure. Development itself can increase flooding if it's not regulated. And then you add on top of that climate change. So that's unsustainable unless we take action. And that's what this rulemaking is about. So going back to 2020, Governor Murphy had signed Executive Order 100 and Administrative Order 2020-01 by then Commissioner McCabe, directed DEP to integrate climate change considerations such as sea level rise, chronic flooding, precipitation into its regulatory and permitting programs. So this is a piece of that. It's an effort to take the data and the science that we have and take what we know has happened and will continue to happen and put it into our stormwater rules and our flood hazard rules so that people are safer, and ultimately that things that are designed today are not just safe for today, but they're safe for the lifetime of the structure. That's the goal. So just a little background, obviously higher temperatures in the atmosphere have been occurring, and that increases the energy in the atmosphere, which increases the potential for more intense storm events. Some studies show that by the end of the 21st century, that heavy storm events are projected to occur 200 to 500 times more often and with more intensity than in the previous century. And I don't have to remind everyone the major floods that have hit just in this century so far. And that doesn't include the flash floods that seem to be happening every time we turn around. It seems like there's another report of a flash flood happening somewhere. And that's not surprising, right? Because intensifying rainfall means intensifying flooding. Storm sewer systems can only handle so much water. And the data that things are designed on, even today, is based on data that we have from the National Weather Service that was only updated through 1999. So when someone is designing something even for today's conditions, it's not even today's conditions, right? It was based on the 1999 data. And of course, we know that this precipitation expectations that presently guide our policy don't accurately reflect the current precipitation intensity conditions. So this is our situation before we adopted this rule. And here's kind of some of the data that we can show. So we partnered with the national DEP and the Northeast Regional Climate Center partnered. And there were two pieces to this study that we did. One was, well, what's happened since 1999? Because that's a long time ago at this point. Have things changed since then? And the second piece of it was, how are things anticipated to increase or change going into the future? And as you can see from this schematic, that since 1999, the 2-year storm has increased by as much as 5%, 10-year storm has increased by as much as 7%, and the 100-year storm has increased by as much as 15% in some counties. That's just in a 23-year period. And then in projecting in the future, if you look at that map of New Jersey that shows the different counties, that shows the probable projected increase in the amount of extreme precipitation that would occur during, say, the 100-year flood. So, for example, the 100-year storm, which today is 8.5 inches of rain, give or take, is likely to be as much as 50% more in some counties by the end of the century. So if you're designing things with today or 1999's data in mind, it's not going to be protective of those future conditions. So the effects of increasing precipitation are obvious. It adds stress on already overtaxed infrastructure, overwhelms stormwater management systems, It increases fluvial flood depths, doesn't change the sea level, but it increases our riverine systems. And obviously there's an increased risk to life and property. So when we first went down this path to incorporate this new data, it was triggered, let's say, by what we saw during Ida. And it's not because of Ida, but Ida was a kind of a wake-up call as to what we unfortunately are going to be experiencing more and more as future progresses. So almost 2 years ago now, we had the remnants of Tropical Storm Ida pass through. Newark, for example, experienced the highest 1-hour rainfall that's ever been recorded there. The National Weather Service documented over 10 inches of rain in certain parts of the state in the center. I happen to live in the kind of ground zero of it, and we had, I think I looked at the nearby gauge, and it was literally off the charts for the rainfall. It was like a 10,000-year flood event. But the problem is that it doesn't happen once every 10,000 years, and that's the problem that we're trying to address. So as an example, and looking at the data that we had after Ida, we said, let's compare what the flood elevations were in Ida along major rivers as compared to our design flood elevation today. Now, this little picture here is a little blurry, but if you can recognize where this is, I live in Hunterdon County. This is taken from the ShopRite parking lot on Route 202. And when I saw this photo, and you can see there's about 3 feet of water here in the parking lot and in the roadway, I thought, well, I know the area pretty well. I don't think there's any stream or river near here. So I looked at the maps, and there's nothing anywhere near here. So this is all runoff that's coming from Flemington, the center of town, development that has gone back 50 years or so that has little or no stormwater management, and even some newer development that has stormwater management. But the stormwater system on 202 could not possibly handle all this water. And so Route 202 became a river. And there were numerous fatalities on Route 202, people being stranded in their cars, and because it happened very quickly. And there were actually 30 fatalities as a result of just that one storm. So here's kind of a snapshot of what's been happening that I think illustrates very well where we are. So if you look at the Raritan River at Bound Brook, there's USGS gauges along all of our rivers and streams, and here's one. And we looked at the data that was here. And you can see that Ida actually matched Hurricane Floyd. Now, Hurricane Floyd was a huge, widespread impact where Ida was not. And it matched that. And what's the takeaway here, which I think is astonishing, is that at this location, we've actually exceeded this 500-year flood 3 times since 1999. So if you're having a flood 3 times in a 23-year period, that should only be happening on average once every 500 years. It has a 0.2% chance of happening every year. Then there's something wrong with the statistical basis that we're using to create these maps and come up with the probabilities. And here, this kind of shows everything too. Here's the Millstone River at Manville before Ida. And here's the same location during Ida. And you can see the extent of flooding that comes past this railroad line. And you can see this entire neighborhood is flooded. Well, if you compare this with the flood insurance rate maps, and it's a little bit hard to see, but if you look at that building in the top left corner, the one that's shaped like a 7, if you use that as your guide, you can kind of see the flood map. This is where that residential subdivision is. This is where all those homes are. None of them are mapped in the floodplain. None of them were alerted by anyone that maybe getting flood insurance was a good idea. Now, some of them probably had it because they've been flooded before, but there's nothing to compel someone to have flood insurance unless your lender requires you to have it. So what we saw in Sandy and what we saw in Ida too was that people, when they pay off their mortgage and they no longer have a lender, they dropped their flood insurance because they're often on fixed incomes and flood insurance is not inexpensive. And so there were a lot of people during Ida that were impacted that were outside that line because, again, the flood doesn't know it's supposed to stop there. So those are the people that we're trying to protect, the people that are outside the line and the people that are inside the line so that they understand what the actual flood risk is to them. Now, this is kind of an anecdotal thing, but this is the road I live on. And I just want to kind of show you what has happened. And here's the before and here's the after, same location. right? I took the first picture off of Google Maps because I didn't have a picture of the road, but the second one I took, and you can see the tree on the right side is the same location. So the Wickeecheokee Creek, which was about 100 feet to the left of the road, decided that it wanted to be where the road was, and the damage matched up very well with where the floodway was shown. And so this road was out of service for about, I don't know how long it took for them to put it back. It was months and months before they were able to put it back. And the township did a great job, but it only recently was restored to its pre-damage condition. And so there was about a 2 or 3 day period where we couldn't have gotten to or from our house. Now, my house is not in a flood zone, and the road in front of my house is not in a flood zone, because that would be too ironic if I lived in a flood zone. But it never occurred to me that the road that I live on could be damaged or destroyed, and then I might be trapped. So if we had a medical emergency during that period, people would not have been able to get to us. Now, it should have been an indicator that the name of the road is Lower Creek Road. And I was at a seminar in New York a few weeks ago, and somebody said, well, if somebody doesn't know the flood conditions of an area, what can they do if you're buying a piece of property? And I said, well, look at the name of the road. If you live on a road called Lower Creek Road or Bayside Drive or Valley View Terrace, you might have some flooding problems. If you go to Hilltop Crescent Court or something, then you're probably safer. But anecdotal, but this is real impacts, and people were hurt. So let's move on to what we've done. As you know, back in December, we proposed an inland flood protection rule, and that proposed amendments to the stormwater management rules and the flood hazard rules. And those amendments were adopted with some minor changes on July 17th, just last Monday. So some key points to it in the stormwater rules is that when you're designing a stormwater management system, you have to design it not just for today's precipitation, but also for the anticipated future precipitation that may occur on a site. The idea being that if it's that what you're designing should be safe for today and should be safe for the future. For the engineers out there, it prevents the use of the modified rational methods for stormwater calculations. I'm not talking about, pipe size or, pipe capacity, that sort of thing. But like if you're figuring out the runoff from an area, you can't use those methods anymore because they're not as accurate as other methods. And the key points in the flood hazard rule is that when you're choosing to use mapping, you take the maps that we have and you add 2 feet to it to find out your design flood elevation from our previous standard. So our previous standard was you use what's shown on a state flood map, if there is one, or you use the FEMA map plus a foot, whichever's higher. Now it's the state map plus 2, or the FEMA map plus 3, whichever's higher. And that becomes your design flood elevation. Now, we always give people a choice. If someone thinks that by adding that factor safety to the flood map in their area overestimates flooding and it disproportionately impacts them, then there's always the opportunity and the option to recalculate the flood there based on the future precipitation data. And that's what's important, is that when someone's calculating a floodplain limit, whether it's in an area that has a map or not, it should be based on, and the rule requires that it's based on, future projected precipitation. And so again, that makes sure that we're not designing for today's flood hazard area, but for the future flood hazard area. And another important piece, and we've been working with our partners at FEMA who have been extremely helpful through this process, is we want to ensure that anytime we issue a flood hazard permit and a coastal zone management permit, because that ties into flood hazard, that we meet or exceed federal standards. And that's extremely important because New Jersey is a community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. And it's incumbent on us to make sure that what we're allowing for state projects and for everyone else meets those standards. So this rule takes a great step forward in closing any kind of potential gaps in our program to make sure that we meet those federal minimums. So here's a diagram that shows a river and 3 houses, and this kind of illustrates what we're talking about. Here's the current, it's the previous flood hazard area, right? So this was prior to last Monday. This is where our regulatory flood was. And adding 2 feet to it, it not only makes it 2 feet deeper, but it also makes it wider, right? Because land that was outside that line is now encompassed by this flood. So you might be thinking, I'm going to buy that blue house and I'm outside the line and I don't have any flood issues. But the truth is that in the future, at some point, you're likely to have flooding issues. And we want people to know that. And we want that blue house to be designed with that in mind. Now, we looked at stormwater management and did a few examples of like, well, what would the practical impact be of using the data that's adjusted from 1999 to today's conditions, and also using those projected future precipitation conditions. So we wanted to see what that might do on different scenarios. So we took a 2.5 acre site in Sussex County, and we looked at different soil types, and we said, let's just assume that it's all forested today, and people bought it and they completely paved the whole thing and put a warehouse on it. So on the top there, you can see there's a little chart, and there are a lot of variables that go into stormwater management design. So this is just kind of a snapshot and an example based on our scenario that we chose. But you can see on the top left, there's 4 different soil types that we use: A, B, C, and D. A being the most pervious, D being the least pervious. And the first thing we did was we said, well, assuming some basic things on the site, what percentage of the site would need to be occupied by stormwater management systems above ground to capture and control the runoff based on the previous rules, right? So you can see, depending on the soil type, it ranges from like about 11.2 to about 8.6 in that range of the site. And again, there's a lot of variables, and you can do some things underground and whatnot. But we said, let's take that same scenario and now increase the precipitation and see how much the size of that BMP is changing. So to adjust it to the current 2019 data, right? That's because that's what the update was in that study from 1999. It's a marginal increase in the area of land, right? Less than 0.4% of the land. And even when you use the new future projected precipitation, it only increased the size of the BMP on the site to another 2.5% of the site. So we're not talking tripling the size of these BMPs. And of course, it depends on so many things, like the depth of your water table, or whether you can manage stormwater underground, or whether you're splitting it up into different pieces or whatnot. But this, we thought, was a good illustration of what we should expect. And then we took the same site and said, all right, well, let's say there's less intense development, and instead of putting in a warehouse, putting in a subdivision, right? So let's say a 5-home subdivision, half-acre zoning. It's the increase is marginal, even for the new future projected precipitation to the end of the century. So it seems important to us and obvious to us that we make that change. So that's kind of how we got where we are and sort of what the impacts are. But now I'm going to walk through what specifically the changes are. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading each one of these things, but if there's interest in them, or we can go back to them. And I said, as I mentioned, since this is being recorded, and also since we can share this presentation with folks, you can go back and you can see. So the next few slides, next about 20 slides, show every single change that we made in the rule, explains them, and then there'll be a time for Q&A. So we added in the stormwater management rules. So the first part of this is the stormwater management rules, and then I'll go over what we did to the flood hazard rules. So the first part is that we added a definition for public roadway or railroad, and a definition for public transportation entity. And the reason why is that there are certain considerations in the rule for public transportation entities, which is any federal, state, county, or municipal government or independent state authority that is working on a public roadway or railroad. And there's different standards for that, because we recognize that there's unique challenges that the public transportation entities face when they're updating their systems, or reconstructing roads, or making improvements to roads. So those definitions explain who this is for. Then in section 1.6, that talks about the applicability to major development. So this is the section of the rule that says this is who needs to come to us, and this is why. And in that section, we amended it to clarify that if a project needs any of the following permits or authorizations, and a technically complete application was submitted to DEP before last Monday, then the whole project is not subject to the new standards, because we have to apply the standards of the rules that are in place when a complete application is received. And of course, the application that's submitted has to have a stormwater management component. And that's important because you could have applied for a freshwater wetlands permit for something that's otherwise a major development, but it doesn't trigger stormwater management in the freshwater wetlands rules, because the way the trigger works in freshwater wetlands is different than flood hazard area and the CZM rules. Now, that's something that we're going to address in the next step of our regulatory reform. So later this year, you're going to see a rulemaking that's going to take the freshwater wetlands rules and make them the same as flood hazard area and CZM. But for now, there's a disconnect there. There's a difference in the way that we deal with things. So if you have a project that has a stormwater management review component and you applied for it before last Monday, then you would be legacied from the rule. And I use that term legacy because the term grandfather has a very sad past to it. So we're not using the word grandfather to describe applications that are not subject to the rules. We talk about legacy. So we're talking about the legacy provisions of the rules. An important thing to note is applications made to the state that will not legacy a project are applicability determinations, which are a snapshot in time of whether or not you need a permit based on the conditions that were present when the determination was made. Flood hazard verifications, which is a process that we go through. It's like a wetlands LOI, and people submit data to us and we verify, yep, this is where the floodplain is today. But the floodplain limits have now changed since this adoption on Monday. And so those verifications are not void, but they can't be relied upon to understand the extent of flooding on a site. And I'm going to give a few examples and explain what that means. Freshwater wetlands LOIs don't interact with these rules, so that doesn't help. Applications made to the state that don't include a stormwater management review component, as I mentioned, like a wetlands, you could have a wetlands GP10 that's building a road that goes to an enormous development that by itself is a major development and would be looked at as a major development by the municipality reviewing it. But the wetlands rules don't trigger the stormwater review component unless it's a major development in the wetlands and transition area. And that doesn't happen that often. So there's a different approach there that, like I said, we're going to address. And applications that are not technically complete prior to last Monday don't legacy you from these new standards. So if you submitted an application prior to July 17th and it's been found to be technically complete within the pre-review period, so in other words, let's say it came in on Friday, July 14th, and the staff is today still looking at it, and tomorrow they decide, yes, this came in as a complete application. That project and that permit application is legacied from these new provisions. But if you submitted it prior to July 17th and subsequently we found that it was not technically complete when it was submitted, then it's not legacied, even if the problem is fixed later. So you had to have gotten in the door by last Monday, before last Monday, and it had to be a technically complete application. Now, projects that don't require our approvals from our group can be legacied if certain local approvals under the municipal land use law are obtained prior to the date of rulemaking. And I'm going to go through some of that in a few slides, but basically what that's saying is that you can have situations where you don't need a state permit, right? Of all the major developments that happen each year in the state, we estimate that about a quarter of them or so need a flood hazard permit or a wetlands permit or a coastal zone management permit. So the state is only looking at a quarter or so of the major developments in the site, whereas the municipalities in the state are looking at all of them. So let's say that you applied to your local community for certain approvals, which I'll show you, that will legacy you from the provisions as long as it was a complete application prior to July 17th. Now, municipalities have a year. This says emergency rulemaking, I should change that, but emergency, we have a year from when we adopted to amend their municipal stormwater ordinance. But anybody coming to the state has to meet those standards immediately. And anyone covered under residential site improvement standards would have to meet it because the residential site improvement standards will be pointing to our stormwater rules. So there's additional legacy provisions for certain public roadway and railroad projects. And this doesn't just mean DOT, this can mean county roads, municipal roads, things that are done by the Turnpike Authority, by New Jersey Transit, by the Port Authority. So there is a provision in the rule that focuses on what DOT calls the preferred alternative, and other entities might not use that term, but there's an equivalent milestone that they'll point to. And what that means is that when improvements to a public roadway or railroad are being contemplated, there's a process that has to be followed of public engagement and scoping out the purpose of the project and understanding what properties will be impacted and putting down like what the goal is. And that there's a lot of work that leads up to that point. And so once that preferred or alternative or equivalent milestone is reached, it's very difficult to go back now and change the project in a significant manner because a lot of decisions have already been made. So the rule has a provision that says that notwithstanding all the other things that we just talked about, that if you're a public transportation entity and you're proposing work along a public roadway or railroad, and you've reached that preferred alternative or an equivalent milestone, then you're going to be subject to the rules that were in effect prior to this rulemaking. And as I mentioned, the logic here is that these projects have already undergone a significant level of planning, and revising them at that point would be probably highly impracticable. Now, that being said, we always have conversations with our applicants to find ways that things can be improved. And so there could be places where a system can be improved and safer without having to go back to that milestone. So what that means is that there's now two tiers of potential legacying, right? You could have projects that were technically complete prior to the GI rule, or reach that milestone prior to the GI rule, the Green Infrastructure Rule that we adopted on March 2nd, that became effective March 2nd, 2021. And so you could be subject to everything else in the rule except for that if you applied prior to March 2nd. And that's where we had before, but now we've got actually three, right? We've got the rules that were in place up to March 2nd. We've got the rules that were in place between March 2nd, 21 and July 17th, 2023, and the ones that are after that. So internally, we'll be tracking projects to determine which ones need to meet which rule and why, and then we can kind of assess how that's working. Now, the heart of this is that in the stormwater management rules in subchapter 5, there are two tables. There's one table that adjusts precipitation to today, or really 2019. So this adjusts the 1999 data to the 2019 data that was presented in that study. So you can see, given what county you're in, you can see that your 2, 10, and 100-year design storms are affected by this percentage. So what you would do is let's say you were in Warren County and you were designing for the 100-year storm at the bottom right corner. You would apply a 1.15% factor to, or 1.1, you apply a 1.15 multiplier to the rainfall shown by the National Weather Service for Warren County for the 100-year storm based on 1999. So if that says 8.5 inches, then you would take 8.5, multiply it by 1.15, and that would be your design storm that you have to deal with. And for future conditions, it's the same. It's the same layout, but the numbers are different, obviously, because this projects precipitation out towards the end of the century. And I may not have mentioned this before, but I've mentioned this in other webinars and discussions that we've had. Why do we choose the year 2100? Well, roads and buildings and businesses and things that are being constructed today have a 50, 75, 100-year lifespan, depending on what it is. And so 2100 sounds like it's very far off, but it really is not. Our kids and grandkids are going to be around to see that. Maybe some of us will be around there to see that. But it's closer than we think, and the changes are so dramatic that it's important, essential, that structures designed today are able to withstand flooding for those future conditions. So you can see these multipliers are much higher because this projects it out to the end of the century. Yeah, let's take a break for a second. I see Glenn Kientz has raised his hand. You may need to unmute yourself because I think everyone was probably muted. All right. Well, while Glenn is figuring that out, let's go to Dave B. in Maplewood Township.
So I do want to highlight that there is a chat box in here, and there's been several people asking questions and whatnot. You've talked about how we have to update our rules, where a lot of this is coming from. I really think that the DEP should take some time after this and go through the meeting chat to get a sense of why of what everyone's questions are that you're not addressing so far.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm because I'm running the presentation, I'm unable to see the chat. I can only see if someone raised their hand. So the thinking was that once we're through this presentation, that would there be time and we would go through the comments that are made in the chat. But if there's something that's relevant right now, we can take it right now since we're paused. I see a hand, Jared Thomas.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
So I had a question. My kind of preliminary interactions with these new rules. One of the things that I have identified is that calculating time of concentration depends on sheet flow calculations, which depend on the 2-year storm precipitation rate. And I want to know right now, Chapter 5 of the BMP manual doesn't really address these new rules. So how does DEP want us to calculate sheet flow for the purposes of determining the TC line? Do we assume the current, the current precipitation at following, or do we use the future precipitation? Because the results of those both have kind of it has a big impact sometimes on that, on how long the TC is for the sheet flow component. Sorry.
Vince,
Yeah.
I can field this one.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gabe.
So first, let me say that Chapter 5 of the BMP manual has been updated and does include specific instruction on how to handle this.
Oh,
So,
it has been. Okay, I did not
yes.
realize.
So if you're calculating the current precipitation, you're going to use the current 2-year storm for the TC. If you're calculating something based on the future precipitation, you're going to use the future 2-year storm for those parts of the calculation. So you will be determining separate TCs for those two separate sets of calculations.
Thanks, Gabe. Let's see. I think there's another hand up, and then we'll go back to the presentation, and we'll capture everybody else at the end. I can't tell whose hand is up though. I just see that there is a hand.
The name is Glenn Kynes. Glenn, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, you can.
All right, let's let Glenn figure that out, and then we'll get to Glenn later on. Glenn, if you come back in and you want to ask your question, you can do so at any time.
Yeah, his computer doesn't have a microphone.
Oh, okay. So it's in the chat.
I saw
His
that
question.
in the chat.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I can't really access the chat right now. So let me go through the rest of the presentation. Yeah.
Vince,
Yes.
his question is, why is Sussex County at 1.50 when it is the most rural and not being developed?
Well, that's a great question. So these numbers don't reflect the level of development in any way, right? What it reflects is the amount of precipitation that area of the state is likely to receive based on the data that we have. And the way that the studies have shown is that some counties are impacted more greatly than others. And so Warren, Sussex, the west corner of the state seems to be impacted more greatly than other parts of the state when it comes to these extreme precipitation events. So it really is not a function of soil type or development level or slope or anything else. It's just how much water is falling from the sky, literally. But that's a great question. All right, I'll start back at where we were, and then we'll get back to any questions that people have. So section 5.4, the groundwater recharge section, where an applicant proposes to recharge the increase of stormwater runoff volume, right? Because there's an option that you can recharge the delta between existing and two-year storms. You have to now calculate these volumes using the projected 2100 two-year storm. For the stormwater runoff quantity standards in section 5.6, you now have 6 different sets of precipitation that you need to demonstrate compliance with. You've got your year 2019 precipitation, and you've got your existing and proposed 2, 10, and 100-year events. Just like today, instead of using 1999 precipitation, you're using 2019. And then you're showing that the year 2100 precipitation for the 2, 10, and 100-year storm is being routed through your system, and that your system is designed to account for that as well. So what that means is that if you're trying to meet the rate reduction requirements and the rule for the 2, 10, and 100-year storm, you'd have to show that you're meeting those rate reductions for the 2019 precipitation and also for the year 2100 precipitation. And again, this is necessary to ensure that BMPs that are put in work today and will continue to work. For the calculation of stormwater runoff and groundwater recharge, you must use the NRCS methodology to determine those runoff values. As I mentioned before, you can't use the rational or modified rational method for hydrograph computations, but that doesn't affect your storm sewer designs. And those are the changes that we've made to the stormwater rules, which are significant, but kind of targeted and limited to those things. And let me go through the changes to the flood hazard rules. No, actually, I'll take that back. Why don't we take a minute or two for questions that we might have right now on stormwater before we shift over to flood hazard, and at the end we can answer any questions. If there's questions in the chat, maybe Jesse could read them to me, or if someone has their hand raised. I think Tom.
Sure. Okay. Just going to start at the top. Okay, confirming the plus 3 feet is not applicable to coastal flood elevations.
That's correct. This rulemaking only addresses riverine systems and fluvial flooding. So the next rulemaking will address flooding along the ocean as a result of sea level rise.
Okay, also confirming it is FEMA 100 plus 3 feet, not FEMA 500.
It is FEMA 100 plus 3 feet, not 500.
Can you provide more detail on computing or locating projected rainfall data?
In other words, like the basis and background for how we got there. Probably not something that we can cover in depth here, but suffice it to say that, as I mentioned earlier, that we partnered with folks, and Cornell and Rutgers were involved, and the studies were done, New Jersey specific studies that focused on the amount of rainfall that are likely to occur. And we took, there's always a probability that, there could be a median value of what the precipitation could be. There could be, different statistical scenarios. And so we always take the high end of the likely range. So the likely range in statistical analysis in these cases is between the 17% and the 83% probabilities. And so we picked the numbers where there would only be a 17% probability that they would be exceeded. So Sussex County has a multiplier by 50%. So there's only a 17% chance that that number will be exceeded by the end of the century. So that means that there's a chance that it could be exceeded. It could be more than 50%.
Okay, will new infrastructure projects, bridges, be prioritized by DOT if they are resilient alternatives to existing frequently flooding bridges?
I can't speak for DOT and what they'll prioritize. I can tell you that, we've been working with DOT, and they've been great partners with us on this, trying to see where we can add value, because that's really what this is all about, is finding where we can add value, where we can increase safety, and how to do that. So can't really speak to whether what their priorities would be.
Okay, question from Terza. As you know, pending before DEP is the Bridgepoint 7 warehouse complex proposed in West Windsor along 2 county roads. The application before the county remains incomplete to the best of my knowledge. Can the county apply the new maps under the inland flood protection rules? The township to this point takes the position that it is bound by the maps of 1999.
I'm not familiar enough with the project, Terza, to be able to give you a great answer. I mean, I'm aware of it, but I'm not sure what the details are. I'd be happy to talk to you offline to try to figure out what, where that stands. I mean, the municipal entities have a year to incorporate the standards, unless it's a residential development, right? So, but it's the county planning board in this case. I'm not really sure. So, Gabe, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, if we're talking about the flood maps, I don't know what role the county plays in enforcing those. Then the same is true if you're talking stormwater standards, right? Our program is set up to be enforced at the state level and the municipal level. What the counties do in terms of stormwater is their own decision, and they're not really required to do anything under our rules.
And if it's the flood maps that we're talking about, then that has changed. So everyone has to now design for that new standard, unless they submitted a complete application under the municipal land use law. So let's assume that they haven't, then any flooding in the area would now be subject to these new rules. So we can.
The project she's talking about, though, it did make an application to the department already.
Okay. Yeah, rather than spend a lot of time talking about this, because I recognize this is important and I don't want to rush it. Let's have a side conversation. Maybe Gabe and I can talk to you about it, Terza. All right, let's get back to the presentation. I know there's a lot more questions, but I want to make sure we get through the end, and then we can kind of talk about everything, because some of the questions we've had so far about flood hazard. So let me talk about flood hazard. We've made some amendments to our purpose and scope in the rule in section 1.1, and that's basically why we're doing what we do. And we talk about that climate change is one of the factors that we are regulating for and adapting to. There's a new definition for public transportation entity, just like stormwater. And here's a good way to look at it. All regulated activities in both the old and newly expanded flood hazard area are subject to the new standards, like now, except in 4 cases. There's only 4 ways out from under this, and the legacy provisions in flood hazard are more narrow than stormwater. So the first case is, let's say that you had that 3-unit subdivision, and let's say that you are on the left side, let's say that's the current or the previous flood hazard area. And so you only needed a permit for that red building, because the yellow building and the blue building that you were building are not in the floodplain. But now the blue building is in, right? So we're going to address what that looks like. Case 1, the regulated activity is part of a project that has a valid permit. So if you have a permit for that red house, then the blue house and the yellow house, being part of that project, don't have to come back to the state for a new permit, because we've already looked at the project, right? So that's that example there. Case 2, the activity was part of a project that does need a permit, and a technically complete application was submitted prior to last Monday. So if 2 weeks ago you submitted an application for this subdivision and only the red house was in the floodplain, and then the newly expanded floodplain that includes that blue house won't affect you, because you have a complete application in the door before July 17th. Now, the case number 3 is, let's say that you didn't need a flood hazard permit for any part of the project. Let's say you were building 3 houses and none of them were in today's floodplain prior to July 17th. And now they are, because the floodplain has gotten larger. If you didn't need a permit before July 17th and you've received one of these 5 municipal approvals prior to July 17th, then you would be legacied from these standards. If you don't have one of these 5, then you would not be legacied, and your project would now need a permit. And this is important to note for things like permits by rule, because permits by rule, you know, there's 2 kinds of permits. There's permits that are promulgated as part of the rule, GPs and GP by certifications and permits by rule. And then there's individual permits, which is the detailed review back and forth that we do for most of the projects in flood hazard area. But you could have an activity that's authorized under a permit by rule to do XYZ, and you don't get a permit application from us, right? You don't have to supply anything to us. It's a automatic approval that if you do things in this manner, you don't need to come into DEP for additional approvals. Well, the floodplain limits have now changed. The flood hazard area is wider and higher than it was before. So you could be in a situation where you were covered under a permit by rule and now are no longer covered by a permit by rule. So those are things that we need to talk through on a case-by-case basis with folks, because they need to understand, what the implications are. And the 4th case is that, let's say that you didn't need a flood hazard permit, and you didn't need any of those municipal approvals, but your construction has commenced prior to July 17th. So let's say that you're DOT and you don't need approval under the municipal land use law. If you have begun construction prior to last Monday's rule adoption, and you didn't need a permit from us before that, then you're also legacied from it. So here's the old flood hazard elevation, and here's the new flood hazard elevation. So this shows a house. Next time I'll draw it with a road, because that would be more accurate here. But let's say that someone was building in that zone and they didn't need a municipal approval because of who they were or what they were doing, and they didn't need a permit before, then they would be legacied as long as they start to construct. But starting construction, there's a lot of words there. I won't read it all, but really what it means is placing permanent structures on a site. It doesn't mean clearing. It doesn't mean grading or filling or digging holes or grading the site to prepare for development. It means putting in like the foundation of a building or the base for a roadway and so on and so on. So this definition is in the rule, and you can see it. There's citations at the top there to show you where to find it. So determining the flood hazard area limits and floodway limits, there's 6 methods in the current rules and prior rules. And I'm going to show you how each one of those 6 methods have been affected. So method 1 is if you're relying on a DEP map. So your new design flood is 2 feet higher than the design flood shown on the department delineation, which is a little confusing, because what we're saying is that the design flood is 2 feet above the design flood. So I tried to word it as clearly as I could in the rule, but what it basically means is that you pull out the state map, you find your design flood that's depicted there on the profile, and you add 2 feet to it. And that's your design flood under method 1. Method 2 is the FEMA title method. That's unchanged because this rulemaking only addresses riverine or precipitation-driven flooding. So this method will be addressed in the upcoming NJPAC proposal that we've talked about many times. Method 3 is the FEMA fluvial method. The new design flood elevation is now 3 feet above FEMA's 1% flood elevation. So you look at the flood profile, you add 3 feet to it. And when you look in the rules in section 3.2, it'll tell you that you have to use the higher of method 1 or method 3. So you would look at the design flood under method 1, which is DEP plus 2, and you'd look at FEMA under method 3, which is FEMA plus 3, and whichever one of those is higher is the one that you would use as your design flood. Method 4 is limited to situations where you're doing work in a channel like a bridge or a culvert, or you're doing some kind of flood control project in the channel that changes the flow rates and whatnot. And so rather than make people go back and recalculate what the flow will be for those channels, you can use 125% of FEMA's 1% peak flow rate. So it's a little weird, because what you have to do under method 4 is take FEMA's 100-year peak flow rate, which you can get from the flood insurance studies, add 25% to it, calculate where that flood elevation will be, and then add 2 feet to it. And that's your new design flood elevation. So when you're designing bridges and culverts, you kind of have to back into the answer, because adding 2 feet to it will add to the flow rate sometimes significantly, and you're going to have to figure out what that is at each given location. Kudos to anybody that knows where this is. I've used this photo before. Couple guesses as to where this picture was taken. Not by me. Gabe knows because it's close to where he went to school.
I answered last time too.
I know.
Is it Lambertville?
No, same river, wrong bridge, but it looks.
Got it right in the chat though. Anthony Lopez put it in the chat. Phillips.
There you go. Yeah, that's the Free Bridge in Phillipsburg during the 1955 flood event. The story that I heard from someone who saw it was that a barn was floating down the river. The barn had chickens on top of it, and all the kids were watching the barn flow down, and it smashed into the bridge and took out the center span between the piers. And they said there were chickens running around Phillipsburg and Easton for like days after that. So some useless information for you. Okay, method 5, the approximation method. So we went into the table. If you use the approximation method, it's based on what watershed management area you're in and what your drainage area is. And there's numbers that say if you're in this drainage area and if you have this much drainage area and you're in this watershed management area, then your flood depth from the average stream bed elevation is 7 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet, whatever. So we took those numbers and we increased them by 1 foot instead of 2 feet, because when we created the approximation method back in 2007, we wanted to make sure that we were being suitably conservative. And having used it for the past 16 years, we realized that we didn't need to add 2 feet to it. 1 foot was enough to make sure that it approximated the same flooding. And this is used in areas where there's no map at all. And then method 6, which is what you would use if you don't have a map, or if you don't like the map, because you're going to have that option. So it's using the map plus the factors of safety that we described under methods 1 and 3, or calculating yourself. So you would use the adjustment factors listed in that new table to determine the peak the 1% peak flow rate using the 2100 precipitation, and then you increase it by 25%. So you figure out your new flow rate based on the future rainfall, increase it by 25%, and then you use that flow rate to calculate the limits of your floodplain in a Heck-Rouse model or whatever model that you're using. And it's the same multipliers that are used in the stormwater management rules, but since the flood hazard rules only talk about the 1% flood, you'll see the tables there don't include the 2-year and 10-year storms. I mentioned this before, and this is an important point. Obtaining a flood hazard area verification or applicability determination prior to the rulemaking does not exempt a new project from the standards. Verifications and APDs are a snapshot in time, and just like freshwater wetlands LOIs, site conditions can change over time. And there's language that we put in our verifications and applicability determinations that say, right now, for the conditions that are present today, here's what the scenario is. You need a permit, you don't need a permit, you're outside, you're inside, whatever the case may be. That has now changed. And it's pretty easy to figure out whether you're in the jurisdiction or not, because you could take the line off that verification and add 2 feet to it and figure out what the new flood elevation would be and whether that impacts your property. And it doesn't mean that we're revoking the verifications. It doesn't mean that everybody has to go back and revise them, but it does mean that if you got a verification a few months ago, and now you're coming in for a permit based on that verification, you still have to design your site to meet today's standards. So you can use that verification as a basis, but you'd have to add that 2 foot factor safety to the flood elevation that's determined on it. And here's that language. I won't bore you with reading it, but this is what it says in the rules related to us issuing verifications and people's reliance on them. And there's some examples given in the rule that, like, if we change the flood hazard areas or repairing zones, and that happens like under freshwater wetlands LOI, that would happen sometimes where we would issue an LOI. It had a 50-foot transition area. And then subsequent to the LOI, we found out that there was threatened or endangered species habitat. And now it's 150-foot transition area. Now we'll recognize where the development is, and we can account for things the way they've developed since the verification or the LOI was issued, but you don't get off completely from it, right? We have to have that dialogue and understand like what the impacts will be for the project. And this basically just kind of repeats what I said. If you had a verification and you subsequently apply for a permit, the project needs to be revised to reflect the new rules that we adopted last week. And then there's a provision in the rules that if you got a verification and then you subsequently got a permit, we reissue the verification along with the permit, because the permitted activities actually can change the floodplain limits on a site. And also we want to make sure that the verification, that the validity of it runs concurrent with the individual permit. So let's say a year ago, you got a verification, and then tomorrow you're applying for a permit that you get later this year. So we would give you the individual permit or the general permit or whatever it is, and then we would reissue the verification, and the reissued verification would reflect what our decision was on the permit. So it would reflect that added 2 feet. We put standards in 2 sections of the rule that deal with our promulgated permits in section 6.7 and our individual permits in section 10.1. And it's kind of an umbrella language that says that we're not going to issue an approval under the Flood Hazard Control Act rules if it doesn't meet federal minimums. So in a case where, and this could affect situations where, let's say there's a hardship exception, in the vast majority of cases, the pre-existing and certainly today's rules meet or exceed all federal minimums. New Jersey has the most protective statewide floodplain management program in the country. But there were some situations where people could revise maps or get a hardship exception under the flood hazard rules where it might not, the result is that the permit might not meet those federal minimums. And there's variances from FEMA too, but the variances under FEMA are different than the flood hazard exceptions, hardship exceptions. So we're trying to marry those up and make sure that we don't issue a permit for something that doesn't meet the community's National Flood Insurance Program commitments. And that's because we want to set people up for success and not failure. We've had situations where we issued a permit and it didn't meet federal minimums, and then the local floodplain administrator and construction official were left trying to decide how to deal with that. Well, the state flood hazard program said it was okay. I guess it must be okay, but each community has an obligation directly to FEMA to meet those minimum standards. And so we want to make sure that we support that. And then just a few more slides. Section 12.6 in the rule that deals with roadways and railroads and parking areas. And the way it's structured is, and there's a lot of text here and I'm not going to read through it all, but basically the starting point for everyone, whether you're a public transportation entity or a private entity, is that the travel surface of that railroad or roadway should be constructed at least 1 foot above this new design flood elevation, right? So if you're using a FEMA map and it's FEMA +3, that means that the surface of the road should be at FEMA +4. 3 + 1 is 4. Now, if you're a public transportation entity, though, we recognize that you're, let's say, doing a bridge replacement or you're doing some work on a public roadway, and there might not be any possible way to elevate it that high because you could be under a few feet of water today. So is there an opportunity to add value and make the roadway safer? Possibly, and that's the kind of conversation that we would have during our permitting process. But there's language in the rule that recognizes some of the unique challenges facing public roadways. And so if you're a public transportation entity and then you have some considerations that the rule provides. So there's flexibility in 3 cases. One is that if the public transportation entity shows us that the project is, we'll say, limited in scope and just consists of safety or state of good repair improvements. So, you're milling and repaving, you're fixing a guide rail, you're doing intersection improvements. There's really not an opportunity in those cases most of the time to elevate the road at all. Maybe you could elevate it 6 inches or 12 inches or something at an intersection, but which we would encourage and which we would talk about during the permitting process. But we recognize you're not going to be able to raise it 5 feet or whatever it might be to meet the new standard. Second is that the second case scenario is that it's not limited in scope. It's a bigger project that we otherwise would look at for elevating. But again, prior to the rulemaking, the project reached a milestone into the development, like that preferred alternative or equivalent. And that redesigning the site would require, to meet the rules would require significant redesign of the project, significant modifications or additions to private land acquisition. So the idea is that if going back on a project that's past that milestone means basically a redesign of the project, then there's flexibility there. It doesn't mean that there's no standard. It just means that we recognize that the highest standard can't always be reached. And the third scenario is even if it hasn't reached that milestone and it's a project that is not just limited in scope, if strict compliance with meeting that elevation standard would result in prohibitively high construction costs, a design that blows away our net fill requirements, which, along public roadway is not necessarily the case because public roadways are exempt from net fill. Or a design, and this one is important to me as an engineer. I look at this as like, all right, well, yeah, we could design it this way, but it's not going to meet AASHTO standards. That's obviously a big problem. Or there's unavoidable environmental impacts that could occur. So sometimes raising the road and changing the dynamics of flooding, opening up a bridge could cause flooding, it could cause environmental impacts and so on. So these are the scenarios that we would be able to apply flexibility under this section for public roadways and railroads. So where flexibility is being sought, a licensed professional engineer in New Jersey has to certify and provide supporting documentation that every reasonable effort has been taken to elevate as much of the roadway or railroad as you could, as close as you can to that design flood elevation, given the scope of the project. That the railroad or roadway is designed to the maximum extent practicable to resist damage, displacement, or loss of service. So, okay, if the road's going to be overtopped by 3 feet, is the roadway going to be able to withstand that? Is it designed so that the structure will still be there, or is the road going to wash out during the flood? No extraordinary risk is posed to any person using the railroad or roadway. And the project meets one of the cases where flexibility is allowed, as we discussed. And in all cases where a public transportation entity is designing a road that is less than 1 foot above the design flood elevation, which is the standard that everyone starts out with, as I mentioned, they have to put signage in prominent locations along any of the new reconstructed or expanded sections of the roadway or railroad, if that's relevant, that's not being elevated to that standard. So that way people have an understanding of the likelihood that an area could be flooded. And that informs how they design, that informs where they buy, where they build. So, okay, that is my long, detailed presentation, and I will hang out as long as you'd like to answer questions that you might have. And I can go back to any slides that you may have, but I will need a little help from someone because I can't quite see the chat. Maybe if Jess, could you moderate and kind of pick between the people raising their hands and
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, and I apologize, not able to tell who. Oh no, I can hear. Okay, first we're gonna go with Andy. He's a guest, so I do not know your last name, Andy. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Vince, for this great presentation. Yeah, I have a question regarding the grandfathering conditions. There are two scenarios. So, for example, if it is technically complete before the July 17th, but the design under old rules may cause property and life risk to nearby residential properties, will be still grandfathering?
So the question, I think, good morning, by the way. So the question is, I think that if a project were legacy that came in before July 17th, but then it was found to cause, and it was technically complete, so it came in and it was being reviewed, but it was found during the review to cause some offsite flooding or some unsafe condition. Yeah. So our rules actually prevent us from issuing permits that would do that. So that is something that we'd have to look at. I guess your scenario is saying that it might be safe for the prior flood, but not safe for the future flood. Is that what you're thinking? Yeah. That's a hard question to answer because I think it's going to be very site by site specific. I'd like to say that we you know, the whole goal of the Flood Hazard Area Control Act is to protect people from the dangers of flooding. And so we do everything that we can to make sure that projects are being approved that are safe, and that takes into consideration all of the data that we have. But I'm not sure that would happen a lot. So I think that would have to be case by case scenario.
Okay, yeah, there's another scenario is that if the technical complete again, but the subsequent review shows that the application maybe needs a major modification, or maybe need a submit application for a different permit, for example, like a dam safety permit, will be still grandfathered in?
So any kind of other permits like dam safety wouldn't trigger any change to flood hazard. So if you had a technically complete application prior to July 17th and you subsequently got a flood hazard permit, then you're fine. And you know, the need for other permits doesn't affect that. If you decided that you needed to change the project, you needed to come in for a major modification. So to the extent that the modification impacts portions of the site, we would look to see where you could increase flood protection to meet the current rules, because when you come in for a modification, you're basically looking at the current rules. But there's a provision in the flood hazard rule that talks about like if you have started to construct already and now you have to change something or your permit expires, there's some provisions for that, because we recognize that if you built 80% of your site, you might not really be able to do much for the other 20%. But you know, the short answer is that if you're coming in for a modification, it should meet the standards that are in place when the application comes in, just like a permit. But we recognize that that's not always achievable because of the decisions that were made on the first permit.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you very much, Vince.
Sure.
Daniel Loomis.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Just a quick question on the today's rainfall versus future rainfall. What's the purpose of designing for 2019 or 2019 and 2000 or 2100 if everything has to work with the 2100 storm?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And in flood hazard, we look at that future flood because it's an expanded limits, and we want to make sure that a building, let's say, is elevated not just for the 2019 flood, but for the future flood, right? But with stormwater, you have an interesting scenario where you have rainfall intensities that are happening now, and then those intensities are going to be changing through the end of the century. So if we only pointed to the year 2100 precipitation, you might have a scenario where you'd meet that standard, but you wouldn't actually be meeting, let's say, the rate reductions or other volumetric considerations in the rules for the current storms. So you have a scenario where you have to show that, well, it's working today, and it'll work in the future, even if the precipitation increases by as much as this.
So if you're using, I guess you take the current Atlas 14 and you use those multipliers that you were given for 2019 and 2100, right? That's how you come up with your curves for your hydrographs.
Correct. Well, it's for the IETA graph. It's the rate of intensity. Yeah.
So, but if both of those numbers are, you know, in both scenarios, you're increasing, and then in 2100, you're increasing even more. How are you going to have a scenario where 2100, where the 2019 would have one set of criteria and 2100 would, I'm just not following how, if you're expecting precipitation to increase so much by 2100, how is the 2019 not going to work in 2100?
Let me jump in here, Vince. So when we're increasing the rainfall amounts, right, you're also completely redoing both sets of the calculation. So it's the pre-development and the post-development. You're doing that with the year 2100 rainfall. But because you're using a higher rainfall, the allowable discharge from the site also becomes higher for the 2100 scenario. So yeah, if you look at like the 2-year storm for the current precipitation, that's going to be your lowest allowable discharge. So looking at the future projected, it's going to allow you to discharge more in the 2-year storm. So for today's standards, you're actually allowed to discharge less than you can in the future scenario.
So you're using for the existing condition, you're going to use the 2019?
You have to
Projection?
actually, the calculations that you would have done before these rules came into effect, you have to basically completely do twice. Once with the 2100 rainfall and once with the 2019 rainfall. So it's pre-developed 2019 compared to post-developed 2019 for 210 and 100, and then it's pre-developed 2100 compared to post-developed 2100 for the 210 and 100 year storm. So it's now 6 storms you're calculating rather than just the 3.
Okay. And you really think there are going to be scenarios where it would work for 2100, work for 2100 and not for 2019?
There will be some, and I think particularly would be the 2-year storm. But you're right, for the most part, if you're going to meet the 2100, it's going to work out. From our scenarios we ran, that usually is the case.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Joseph Fitch.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
So I had a question on what I call adjacent standards into these rules. Particularly, I've been thinking about soil erosion standards and dam safety standards, and the consideration for drafting these current and future stormwater reports, but also just the applicability, say, of both of those standards and how we relate 2100 data. Am I correct that those standards haven't changed? So our 25-year design storm for soil erosion, which is also what we use for capacity analysis, all of that is still the current design storm methodology, and that there wouldn't be, say, soil erosion riprap design for year 2100.
Right.
Same
So
with dam safety, that the dam itself would only be designed for the current scenarios.
no, that's a great question, and you're right, because there's a lot of different standards that relate to the same thing, right? Whether it's NRCS standards, whether it's dam safety, there's other agencies that use it too. There's 2 ways to look at it. One is that unless someone incorporates these projected 2100 rainfall amounts or multipliers in their rules, then you wouldn't be applying them. So you wouldn't be applying them to dam safety. You wouldn't be applying them through the Department of Agriculture, through the Soil Conservation District. That being said, I know that NRCS and our dam safety group has already started using the 2019 rainfall multipliers, because the thinking is that there's what's already been shown to have happened, and then there's what's projected to happen in the future. So using what's already happened is the prudent thing to do. So I won't speak for the soil conservation districts, but I know that NRCS has told us, and our dam safety group has affirmed, that they would be using the 2019 multipliers to make sure that any standards that are based on, say, the 100-year storm would be based on that. The PMP, the probable maximum precipitation, isn't affected by this. What's interesting in the studies is that the total amount of rainfall that's happening in the state is changing less than what we're seeing is that it's the intensity of the precipitation. It's that you'd have more intense rainfalls when you have a rainfall, so that your 100-year storm event is now much more intense than it was before. And it's kind of like shifting that line and saying, well, what we thought was, a 200, 300, 500-year storm really is now happening once every 100 years. So that's what the adjustments do. And so I know dam safety and NRCS are using it. I've spoken with the soil conservation districts, but I'm not sure what the Department of Agriculture ultimately will decide. But none of them would incorporate the year 2100 unless they change their rules to do so.
Okay, so when we're drafting new stormwater reports, I mean, I look at it as writing 2 reports now, right? Because you're redoing everything. The 2100 report will skip the riprap design because it's already included in the prior report, and then there's only one standard, right? So there's no peak flow from year 2100 that needs to be accommodated for riprap design.
Right, under the soil erosion sediment control standards, unless 2:90 is changed to incorporate 2100, then you would be designing it. Yeah, and I would use the 2019 rainfall even if you're not required to, because that's shown to have already happened, and it's not a significant change anyway since then, so you might as well use it. But I don't even know if that's required yet through the soil conservation districts.
Thank you.
Sure. Good, great question.
Okay, just want to be mindful that we only have about 2 minutes left. So we have one question. Tom, if you could try to keep it quick, from Tom Badowski.
Well, real quick, if I could, I'm okay hanging out a little longer. I don't know if anybody else wants to or not, but I'm okay hanging out for a while longer to answer questions because I recognize that I talked a lot and I want to make sure that we hear from you guys.
Yeah, I could stay till we answer all the questions too.
Okay, thanks, Gabe. Tom.
Hi, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Hi, Tom Podolsky of Warren County, right in the heart of our freak storm a week and a half ago. We're involved with White Township and reviewing a project that is going to potentially be influenced by the new regulations. However, there's no state permits needed. And the question that I have for you is, can a municipality, any municipality, apply the state standards before they adopt the enabling ordinance, which you indicate is they have a year to do?
Gabe, you want to tackle that one?
I mean, they have a year to do it, but you could certainly adopt it sooner than that. So there's no restriction that the municipality takes that year. If the municipality wants to enforce that ordinance, unfortunately, they do have to change their ordinance, right? It's not legal to require someone to meet a standard that you haven't adopted. So if they want to enforce that, they have to adopt the ordinance before someone makes an application to them.
Okay, thank you.
And Tom, I saw some of the damage that happened up there. I was up in driving to Belvedere on Saturday, and I was normally going to try to go up Brass Castle Road and found out that Brass Castle Road is portions of it no longer exist.
Brass Castle Road.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, but that answer does only apply to non-residential projects, right? If it's residential, it's subject to the residential site improvement standards, which incorporate these new changes by reference already. So,
right.
It's residential.
However, yeah, the important project that I'm referring to is non-residential. So I got to get the municipality on the toes. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Jess?
Apologies. Next, we have Bassett Muzaffar.
Thank you, Jessica. Hey, Vince, your friendly county engineer standing here. So, my question is about a commercial development that already has the approval from the municipality. It's a pretty significant development in our county, and they already have gone through NJDEP. Obviously, that's how they got to the stage where they got the permits from the municipality. They are deemed incomplete at our level. My question really is, other than stormwater, they have to give us the reductions for the new, the new storms. Is the applicant obligated to do anything else beyond that?
Well, so it's a private development and needs the county approval, right? You said it already received municipal approval. Yep. And it received all the DEP permits that it needed to get.
Yep.
So this rulemaking would not likely affect it in any way, unless the county incorporated it somehow into its process, right?
We don't have any methodology. We always trust, we follow your guidelines, and the municipality has, they've issued the permit already. We don't have the power to do that, so.
Okay, but I thought that was.
Yeah, there really wouldn't be an obligation that I could see then on the part of the applicant to change something. Now, that being said, I would try to, and I do this, I would try to appeal to people's, sense of like, well, you want this to be safe, not just for today, but for the future. And so there could be some modifications that they can make that would improve things. And I've been able to convince folks to do that in some cases, but if they have their municipal approvals and their state approvals, then this rulemaking would not inform that project.
Vince, I am so happy that you have still faith in humanity. I don't. you know, you are a better person than me. I'm becoming cynical in my old age.
I don't believe it.
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your consideration. I will not take more of your time. I'm sure I'll be hanging out because there'll be more pertinent questions that I can learn from, but greatly appreciate all the input you have given and this lovely presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to see you.
Likewise.
Jennifer Coffey.
Great, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for
Hey, Jen.
having this today. These are, you know, long-awaited rules. I just want to ask a question about the applicability, and I know we've spent some time on this already, but my understanding is the rules are effective as of July 17th, which is the date they appeared in the register. However, we talked a little bit about when municipalities have to come into compliance. So is that specifically regarding updating the stormwater portion for non-residential? Is that what we're talking about? There's
Yes.
nodding heads. Okay. So if a project comes forward and it doesn't need any state permits and it only needs municipal permits, it could technically design on the old stormwater standards for up until July 16th, 2024 at this point.
Theoretically, that's true. Yeah, John, if a municipality took a year to incorporate these new standards in the intermunicipal stormwater ordinance, then for non-residential projects, that would be the case.
Okay.
But if you need a state permit, then that's, you know, we're going to use our standards, and it's only stormwater too. It doesn't affect flood hazard. Flood hazard, the floodplain is now bigger, and so everybody has to deal with that, whether you're commercial or not.
So the flood hazard is effective immediately across the board, but the stormwater non-residential could take a little while to implement. But if you have a project that's coming in for a stormwater permit at the state level or coming in for other permits, so you may review stormwater, you guys are going to enforce the updated stormwater standards. Do I have that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we're going to work with all of our environmental commissioners to get them to be incredible nudges to update their municipal ordinances sooner than a year. So we'll be working together more. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen.
Robert Caluco.
Morning, Vince.
Good morning.
Hey, I just wanted to find out if you guys had determined how to determine the new flood hazard elevations in AO zones.
So an AO zone, for those that might not be familiar, that's generally where there's a depth of flooding shown. So like Plainfield is a good example, right? It says instead of looking at the flood profile and picking a number off of it, it basically says you have 3 feet of flooding no matter where you are. So you take that, it's kind of, I don't like AO zones very much, but what you would do is you would take that AO zone, and if it's a FEMA AO zone, you'd add 3 feet to it. So if the AO is depth of 3, now it's a depth of 6. But you know, whether that's really happening on a given site is hard to say. So, you know, in some places like Plainfield, Army Corps has some better topography and some different calculations that they've done in the town that I think are probably more reflective of what's going on in the community. You know, so we'll look at all of those resources as well.
Thank you.
James Millett.
Good morning,
Jim.
Vince. Good morning, Gabe. I just want to confirm our understanding of how the changes to the flood hazard rules affect bridges and culvert projects. Because 12.7 wasn't revised. And so our understanding is when you're doing the pre versus post analysis of hydraulics, that you're still subject to the same design storms, you know, the 2, 10, 25, I probably missed one, 50, 100, and then the FHA. And so really the only thing that's changed is you've redefined what the FHA design flood is, which is now to include the future 100, 125% of that. But we're not required to do a pre versus post analysis on a current 2 and a future 2.
Right.
And Right, and
Right.
that's really it.
Right. I mean, I would use for all those other storms that you're calculating, I would certainly use the 2019 adjusted data because that's what we're seeing. So I would use that for the 210, 25, 50 events, and then the 100-year and the 100-year event too. But then for your design flood, you'd have to use that bigger flood. So it's really, that's the only one that's changed significantly, is that design flood.
Okay, yeah, that's it. Thanks so much. Great job.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay, Joseph, did you have a new question?
I did. Yeah, I'm back, guys. It's actually, hopefully real quick, two things that I feel are related. The stormwater control ordinance that some people have been commenting on. Yeah, there's now a short version, which is basically what I call the citation version, which will allow municipalities to not have to go through this process repeatedly in the future because they'll have a clean citation in their code. That's something that already exists in many municipalities because some of the engineers and attorneys had foresight to do that under the amended stormwater rules. I still have a little bit of a concern that the municipality should have a public process where if they have a short version, that they reinforce their endorsement of the new stormwater rules and the flood hazard rules in recognizing that the model ordinance has been changed. I think that's just really just for good public housekeeping, not necessarily a legal measure, but I do think it's important that there's some level of education now that we've gotten through the rule adoption for the municipalities to understand the benefits and detriments of the full version and the short version, and particularly that the full version allows the municipality to decide when it will enforce the increased requirement from the state. Because under the MS4 permit, they do have the obligation to comply, but they have this calendar year to do so. So I was wondering if there's going to be more discussion with, the governing bodies and shareholders on that topic before they endorse it and they bring it to adoption. And then as a related matter, I think the other thing we have to all focus on now is the training, the engineers recertification training. I think it's critical that everybody gets recertified within the next couple months because there's significant changes to the design methodology that I don't feel it's appropriate the municipalities take on the liability of the future audit of 2023 projects that are now in the new system without their engineers being fully recertified by DEP on understanding that. So I was just wondering if you could speak to some of like what might come in the future here in terms of shareholder reach out other than this. This is more like, Society Municipal Engineer focused. So you have the right people in the room. And then when we can all sit for your class, because we'd love to come in and sit for your class next week if we could.
So let me touch on the training first. The current version of the MS4 permit actually includes a new requirement that anytime we change the rules, anyone who was previously trained has to take an amendment training within 1 year of when we adopt those rules. Recognizing that there are like a few thousand people that need to take the training, we are going to have to run several sessions. Probably not going to be able to get everyone to be able to attend one, but we're planning on running the first one in August. So it'll be coming up very soon. Announcements of the date should be coming out in the next week or two. So that'll be happening soon.
Okay.
Yeah, as far as the
like
ordinance,
Ticketmaster, we'll all jump down for the pre-sale, right?
As far as the ordinance goes, yeah, we did create that short version of the ordinance because, like you said, other people were already trying to do that. And so we got a lot of requests to create that version that really just references our rules rather than reproducing them. So in that case, like every time we change the rules, they don't need to adopt a new ordinance. I do tend to agree with you that when we change the standards, it's hard for them to start enforcing a new standard without having really ever brought that up at a public meeting. I do question that as well, and I think they should be doing something to alert the public that they're changing their standards. But I'm not sure what they're legally required to do in that regard. I would leave that up to the municipal lawyer to decide what their legal obligation is.
But is there a discussion that's going to be forthcoming from DEP on the value of the difference between the short and long version, or is it really just going to be left up to the municipalities at this point to look at their legal position?
Well, I mean, we'll talk about that at the training a bit.
Okay.
There's also MS4 training that we do. It's a stormwater coordinator training that we're running this summer. And there's a couple sessions that are happening of that, so we'll certainly be discussing that there as well. But, you know, I mean, there are benefits to it because it's easier. You don't have to modify things in the future when we change your standards. But also, if you wanted to do something, a tweak, because you wanted something to be like slightly more restrictive in your municipality because you face whatever certain situation, you also kind of lose some of that flexibility because you're just referencing our rules rather than reproducing your actual standards. So
Correct.
It really depends on the municipalities, what's best for them.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks for the presentation. It's always a pleasure.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day.
Okay, last question from Jameson Zimmerman.
Yes, I was just curious if they had a model ordinance for the flood water management. I see that they have a new ordinance for the SWMP. I'm sorry, for the stormwater. But you guys put together last year a new floodplain management ordinance for all the townships. So I was curious, did you revise that one as well?
So, I mean, this question is about the floodplain ordinances?
Yes,
or-
the floodplain ordinances. And JDEP came up with,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I-
I missed
Vince,
that.
I can answer that question.
Thanks, Cal.
So the flood damage prevention ordinances that we have put out, the model ordinances themselves don't need to be changed because it refers to the rules as amended. What will change is the guidance document that goes with them. So we are in the process of updating our worksheets, the design flood elevation calculations, and all those other documents that go with the ordinances. But as far as ordinances themselves, they don't need to be changed.
but if you had indicated that the design flood elevation has increased to 3 feet in a river area, like for example in Plainfield, but those other ordinances don't reflect that 3 foot of freeboard.
Well, anybody, it's different with the difference between stormwater and flood hazard is that where stormwater, the state is only looking at those projects that need a state permit. And so
Okay.
the majority of major developments are not looked at by the state, but anything in this new bigger floodplain is looked at by the state. So it could be that you have a situation in a municipality where they haven't updated their flood ordinance to point to these new standards, but it doesn't matter because someone that's trying to get a permit to do something in their town, even if the town was able to approve it at a lower standard, when they came to us, we would say, well, sorry, you have to meet the new standard. So it's a little bit different, and it's a little less of a disconnect with timing, because even though the town, like I said, has time to revise it, it practically doesn't matter because the standards have already been revised at the state level.
Okay.
Is that what you're thinking?
So,
Is that your
so
question?
what you're saying though is that, so if the house that's going to be elevated doesn't need a state permit, then it doesn't have to be raised to 3 feet? I guess I'm confused in regards to that.
Anything in the flood hazard area in the whole state needs some kind of approval from the state. So you wouldn't have a scenario where somebody would be building a house in a floodplain and that they wouldn't need some kind of approval from us. There's permits by rule, but like even the permits by rule say that like if let's say if you have a damaged house and you're restoring it, that you have to restore it so that it's 1 foot above the design flood elevation. And so that means even under that permit by rule, you'd have to meet the new standard. So there's no scenario where someone would be in a floodplain and not need some kind of approval from the flood hazard program. Unless it's like an exempt activity, mailboxes and things like that, nobody's coming in for it.
Okay. All right, so basically what it is that we have to follow what the state is in regards to some sort of a damaged house. We have to add, 3 feet now if it's on a river area. But
That's
the
right.
thing is that you guys don't have a model ordinance to reflect that at this time, but it's coming.
Well, some of them, so the model ordinances, and I don't mean to speak for you, but the model ordinances, some of them point to the flood hazard rules as amended. So those have been amended automatically, just like the stormwater ones that we were just talking about before. So some of them point to the flood hazard rules as amended, and some of them point to the flood hazard rules at a date and time, in date and space and time. So those are the ones that have to really be amended. The ones that point to the rules, however whatever form they're in, they've already been updated.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Sure.
And it was done on purpose intentionally because we knew that there could be changes happening at the state level, and we did not want the municipal attorneys and council to go again and redo the ordinances. So we had that language already in it. So if you have adopted the municipal ordinances, you are good to go.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right.
Okay, Vince, are you ready to wrap it up?
One more question. I'm
more
feeling
question.
lucky here. Then we'll
Okay.
then we'll hop off.
Okay, John Ryder.
Okay, thanks. Vince and everyone, great job with this presentation, and great job with rolling out these rules.
Thanks.
Yep. Question I have is, could you explain how the grant or the legacy provisions would affect a project where maybe a minor modification is made to the project, or possibly an extension that either the project has not yet been constructed, or maybe has started construction, and an application is submitted for an extension of the DEP approval.
Yeah, those are good questions, John. It's good to hear from you. So when it comes to modifications, right, there's a wide range of, as you know, of things that you might need a modification for. If it's a minor mod, especially if it's like an administrative issue or something like that, and it doesn't really affect the design of the project, then it's probably not going to trigger anything new. If you were doing something more significant that needs a major mod, then generally speaking, you'd have to meet the new standards. The modified portion of the project would have to be amended to meet the new standards. But we recognize that, like you said, if the project's been started construction already, or let's say that all the roads and everything have been put in place, and now you're putting these buildings in, and there's not as much that you can do, we'd have that dialogue. What I'm seeing is that raising the ground or raising roads and things like that is harder from a net fill perspective than, say, just setting the floor of a building higher. That's more usually has fewer obstacles, right? I mean, it depends on what kind of building it is and how high it is, whatnot, stairs and steps and building access and whatnot. But, the building itself, if you're elevating it up high and the water can get underneath it, then there's no net fill considerations or anything else. So I think that there's going to have to be that dialogue to see, like, well, what value could be added, and whether it's a significant safety issue or not. When it comes to extensions, the existing rules, even pre July 17th rules, talk about that you are eligible for an extension if you get your 5-year permit, and now the 5 years have run out. You can apply for extension, but the conditions on the site cannot have changed. So if someone got a permit for something that was based on the old floodplain, and now the flood elevation is now 2 feet higher, then you wouldn't probably be eligible for an extension in almost any of those cases. You could extend it and modify it, right? You could modify your project so that it meets the new standards and then extend it. That's always a possibility. But you probably wouldn't be eligible to get an extension. Now, again, the rule does talk about how if you got a permit from us and you did a certain level of work before the 5 years was up, then there's considerations for, like, how we'll apply the rules in a case like that, because we're not going to retroactively apply things that are to portions of the site that are already built or locked in for one reason or another.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Vince. I posted in the chat that a recording of today's webinar will be posted on the Inland Flood Protection Rule webpage, and that webpage is posted in the chat as well. Future engagement sessions will be advertised in that same location. The next session we are having is a question and answer session with Vince from 10 to 11 on Tuesday, August 1st. The information, the link and dial-in will be provided on that webpage within the next day or so.
And Jess, I've been trying to attach a PDF of this presentation to the chat, and I can't seem to do it. So I don't know if it's my limitations or the limitations of my computer.
We can
that are
post
causing-
that to the webpage as well.
Okay, I'll email that to you, and then we'll get that up on the webpage. Because
Okay.
and I want everyone to feel free to use the presentation. You know, talk to people about it. You know, ask questions. You know, Gabe and I obviously we have a lot invested in this because this is important, and so we will do everything we absolutely can to make sure that your questions are answered, that you're getting the right guidance, that you're getting consistent guidance. So feel free to reach out to us. All right. With that, thank you for taking almost 2 hours out of your Monday, and we will all see each other soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.